The sterile smell of the oncology ward clung to my clothes as the doctor delivered the news that Julian had stage 4 lymphoma with only months left if we didn't act fast. What hit me harder than the diagnosis was Julian's cold stare when I reached for his hand, his voice flat and final, as he said, "Victor, this isn't your fight anymore. Pack your things and get out of my life." My chest tightened like someone had punched me. The man I'd shared every morning coffee and late-night dream with for 3 years, suddenly shoving me away in that tiny exam room overlooking the busy streets of Chicago. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while outside cars honked, and people rushed by completely unaware that my world had just split open. Julian turned his back, his shoulders rigid under the paper gown, refusing to meet my eyes. "I mean it, Victor. Don't make this harder than it already is," he added, the words slicing through the air like a knife. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing through the last 3 years, how we met at that crowded coffee shop in Brooklyn when I spilled my latte on his laptop, and he laughed instead of getting mad. He was the marketing executive with the sharp suits and quicker wit. I was the quiet accountant from a conservative family in Illinois who had barely admitted to myself that I liked men until he walked into my life. Our first date was a walk along the High Line, where he told me stories about growing up in California, and I shared my fears about my parents never accepting who I was. We moved in together after a year into a small apartment in Manhattan with creaky floors and a view of the skyline that made everything feel possible. Those early days were filled with weekend trips to the Hudson Valley, lazy Sundays, cooking pasta, and quiet moments where his hand found mine without a word. Now all that felt like a distant memory as the doctor left us alone and Julian finally looked at me, his eyes empty. "I don't need a nurse. I need you to leave," he said, and something inside me cracked, but also stirred like a long dormant part of me was waking up to the fact that I had been hiding behind our comfortable life instead of facing the world head on. I left the hospital that afternoon, the autumn wind cutting through my jacket as I walked the streets, aimlessly replaying every moment we had shared, the laughs, the arguments, the way he always knew how to calm my anxiety before big work presentations. By the time I reached our apartment, the sun was setting over the river, and I sat on the couch staring at the photo of us on the mantel from our trip to Yosemite last summer, his arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning like nothing could touch us. The silence was deafening without his usual playlist humming in the background, and I realized then that his cold words weren't just rejection, they were a mirror forcing me to see how much I'd let fear dictate my choices, how I had never fully come out to my family or stood up for us in public when colleagues made offhand comments. That night, I barely slept, the diagnosis and his dismissal looping in my head until dawn broke, and I made a decision I wouldn't walk away without a fight, not for him, but for the man I was becoming. The next morning, I called in sick to work at the accounting firm downtown and headed back to the hospital, determined to break through whatever wall Julian had built. He was in his room, hooked up to monitors, his face pale, but his jaw set when he saw me. "Victor, the first told you to go," he muttered, but I sat down anyway, pulling the chair close. "We need to talk about this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. And for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of real strength rising from the shock. The days blurred into a routine of hospital visits and quiet arguments where Julian kept pushing with those icy remarks about not wanting pity while I refused to leave his side, learning more about his fears than I ever had in our happy times. My boss at work noticed my distraction and pulled me aside one afternoon, reminding me that promotions didn't wait for personal drama, but I didn't care. The old Victor who played it safe was fading. Evenings I spent researching lymphoma treatments online, talking to specialists on the phone, and slowly piecing together a plan that included second opinions and support groups I never thought I'd need. Julian's coldness chipped away at me, but each harsh word also revealed cracks in my own armor. The way I had avoided introducing him to my parents during their last visit to the city, pretending we were just roommates. Now, with everything on the line, I started to see the path forward, one that demanded honesty and courage. By the end of that first week, I had arranged for a family counselor and even reached out to an old friend from college who had gone through something similar. The awakening wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the quiet realization in the hospital cafeteria over bad coffee that love wasn't about perfect moments. It was about showing up even when pushed away. Julian watched me from his bed one evening, his expression softening just a fraction before the mask returned, but I knew then that his words had done what 3 years of comfort never could they had forced me to grow. The days that followed the diagnosis were a blur of unanswered texts and Julian's insistence on handling his treatments alone, but I refused to let his coldness win. Every morning I showed up at the hospital with fresh coffee from our favorite Brooklyn spot and sat by his bed while nurses checked his vitals, ignoring the way he looked away when I tried to talk about our future. "You have your career, Victor. Don't waste it on me," he repeated one afternoon, his voice like ice as the chemo drip hummed beside us. I felt the sting, but instead of retreating, I leaned in closer, telling him about the research I had done, the clinical trial in Boston that might give us more time. Work became a secondary thought. My boss at the firm raised an eyebrow when I requested more time off, but the old pressure to please everyone felt distant now. I called my parents in Chicago that weekend, the conversation heavy with silence after I finally said the word "Julian is my boyfriend," and he's sick. They didn't hang up, but their hesitation spoke volumes about the years I had spent hiding parts of myself to keep the peace. Driving back from the airport after picking up some of Julian's favorite books, I replayed their careful responses the way my mother asked if I was sure this was the life I wanted. It mirrored Julian's rejection, and for the first time, I saw how both had kept me small. Our mutual friend Marcus stopped by the apartment one evening, a straight ally who had been with us since the early days. He listened as I poured out the confusion, the anger at Julian's walls, and my own regrets about never marching in pride or correcting clients who assumed I was single. Marcus reminded me that growth often came from pain, and his words stuck as I headed to another hospital visit. Julian was weaker that day, his skin pale from the latest round of treatment, but when I mentioned my parents' visit, he snapped again, telling me not to drag them into this mess. The argument escalated in the quiet room, his cold words cutting deep about how I had always played it safe, how our relationship was built on convenience, not courage. I left that night, walking the Chicago River, walked the lights, reflecting on the water, as tears finally came, the realization hitting that his push was forcing me to confront the man I had become, the one who avoided conflict at all costs. The next morning, I booked a therapy session online, the counselor helping me unpack the identity struggles I had buried since college, the fear of disappointing my family, the subtle prejudices I faced at work when colleagues made jokes about diversity hires. Julian's condition dipped midweek, requiring an extra night in the hospital, and I stayed through it, holding his hand when he was too tired to protest. In those quiet hours, I saw glimpses of the man I fell in love with, the one who planned surprise picnics in Central Park before we moved. His cold exterior cracked just enough for him to admit the fear of becoming a burden, but he quickly shut down again. I used the time to research support networks for partners of cancer patients, finding online forums where other men shared stories of awakening through crisis. Back at work, I turned down a big project that would have meant late nights, choosing instead to be present for Julian, the decision feeling right for the first time. Friends from our old neighborhood dropped off meals and cards, their quiet support contrasting the distance from my family. Each day the internal storm grew, but so did my clarity. The cold words had stripped away the illusions, leaving room for real connection. By the weekend, I had organized a small care package with photos from our California beach trip, the ones where we looked unstoppable, and left it on his tray with a note saying, "I'm not leaving. Because I love you, I'm staying. Because I finally see who I can be." Julian didn't respond, but his eyes lingered on the pictures longer than usual, and I knew the awakening was spreading beyond me. The tension at home mounted when bills arrived, and I handled them alone, reflecting on how we had built a life together without ever discussing what would happen if one of us faltered. Marcus suggested a walk in the park where we talked about societal pressures, the way gay men were still expected to be strong without vulnerability. His insights helped me draft a letter to my parents explaining my choices, and for the first time, I mailed it without second-guessing. Julian's next treatment session brought more cold remarks, but I met them with steady presence, the growth inside me turning pain into purpose. The week ended with a small victory when the doctor noted stable markers, and I allowed myself a quiet smile in the hallway, knowing that Julian's words had not broken us, they had begun to rebuild me. When my parents arrived from Chicago, The pressure mounted in ways I never anticipated, their awkward acceptance of our gay relationship, turning to open concern about me sacrificing my future for Julian. We met at a quiet diner near the hospital, my mother fidgeting with her napkin as I explained the diagnosis and Julian's distance. Dad kept glancing at his watch, the conservative values they raised me with clashing against the reality of my life in the city. They asked the hard questions about whether this was worth it, the same doubts Julian echoed in his cold words, and I felt the old identity crisis surge again, the boy who once hid magazines under his bed, now defending his love in public. Back at the hospital, Julian was in a treatment room, his face drawn as I introduced them briefly, the air thick with unspoken judgment. He managed a polite nod, but later when we were alone, he lashed out again, telling me not to force family into this mess, his voice laced with the same ice that had started my awakening. The confrontation with my parents continued over coffee the next day, their suggestions about taking a break from my career mirroring Julian's push, and I finally spoke up, telling them that hiding who I was had kept me safe but not alive. The word surprised even me, the growth from the past weeks giving me strength to set boundaries. At work, the societal prejudices I had ignored became glaring when a colleague made a passing remark about personal leave being abused for lifestyle choices. I confronted him calmly. The old Victor would have laughed it off. Julian's condition required daily visits, and during one long afternoon, he admitted through gritted teeth that his coldness came from watching his own father suffer years ago, but he shut down again, refusing to let me in fully. I spent evenings journaling the emotions, the fear of loss mixed with the thrill of discovering my own voice. Friends like Marcus organized a small gathering at our apartment, sharing stories of other couples facing illness, the support, reminding me that our gay community was stronger than the prejudices we faced. My parents left with tentative promises to call more often, their partial acceptance a step I never thought I'd see. Julian's next scan brought mixed news, the lymphoma responding slowly to treatment, and I celebrated quietly with him in the room, his cold mask slipping as he squeezed my hand for a moment. The identity struggles peaked when I attended a local LGBT support group, listening to men share their journeys of coming out and crisis, the stories echoing my own awakening. Back home, I rearranged the apartment, making space for a home office so I could work while staying close, the decision symbolizing my commitment. Julian's cold words resurfaced during a bad night. When pain kept him awake, he accused me of staying out of guilt, but I countered with the truth that his rejection had shown me how much I had been living half a life. The argument ended in exhausted silence, but the air felt clearer. Work offered a promotion that would require travel. I turned it down, choosing presence over prestige, the choice feeling like the man I was meant to be. Family calls from Chicago grew warmer, my mother asking about Julian's progress, a small bridge forming. The week built to a quiet climax when Julian allowed me to sit with him during chemo, sharing a memory from our first Christmas together, the connection flickering despite the walls. Societal pressures followed me to the grocery store, where a stranger's stare at our joined hands reminded me of the world outside, but I held my head high, the awakening turning fear into quiet defiance. By the end of the file, the foundations of change were solid. Victor, no longer the passive partner, but a man ready to fight for the life he wanted with Julian. The breaking point arrived when I found Julian on the phone with his old college friend, discussing how he didn't want to burden me any longer, the conversation laced with plans that sounded like goodbye. I stood in the doorway, the hospital bag in my hand, dropping as his cold words spilled out again, this time to someone else. The fight that followed was raw in the apartment. After his discharge, his accusations of me staying out of obligation clashing with my insistence that his push had awakened something real. "You never fought for us before," he shouted, the illness making his voice weaker, but the pain sharper. I countered with examples of how I had changed, coming out fully to my parents, standing up at work, the growth he had sparked. The misunderstanding nearly broke us. I packed a bag that night, walking the rainy Chicago streets, questioning if love could survive this test. But something pulled me back, the memory of our happy days on the California beach, where we promised forever without knowing what forever meant. Returning, I found Julian on the couch exhausted, and we talked for hours, the first honest conversation in weeks, his cold facade cracking as he admitted the fear of watching me suffer like he had watched others. The betrayal feelings lingered, but understanding bloomed. I saw his push as protection twisted by pain. That conversation marked a turning point. I made a pivotal decision to fight differently by giving him space while proving my presence, the balance hard but necessary. Work suffered slightly, but colleagues noticed my new confidence. One even apologized for past comments, the societal shift small but real. Family support grew, my sister calling from Illinois, offering to visit, the acceptance spreading. Julian's treatment continued with side effects that left him weak, but I handled the medications and meals without complaint, the role feeling natural now. A medical setback midweek sent us back to the ER, the fear real, but my response steady, the awakening turning panic into action. We spent the night in the waiting room talking about dreams. We had postponed the connection, deepening despite the cold words that started it all. Friends rallied, Marcus bringing groceries and laughs, the support network I had built proving its worth. The week ended with Julian reaching for me, in sleep his hand finding mine, the first crack in the wall. I reflected alone, the growth, clear, the man who once hid was now leading. The misunderstanding resolved, not with grand gestures, but quiet persistence, the path forward clearer than ever. Julian's lymphoma markers improved slightly, the hope tangible, as we planned small steps like a short walk in the park, the future uncertain, but ours to shape. The emotional confrontations had forged something stronger, the awakening complete in its early stages. With Julian starting a new phase of treatment, Victor stepped up in ways that surprised even me, the home becoming a sanctuary of quiet strength and shared vulnerability. Mornings involved careful routines, the medications timed perfectly. While I worked from the laptop nearby, the promotion I turned down, feeling like the right sacrifice for this growth. Julian's cold remarks lessened, replaced by tentative thanks, his eyes showing the internal battle he fought alone for so long. Therapy sessions helped me unpack the last layers of identity crisis, the counselor guiding me through the prejudices I had internalized, the family expectations that shaped my silence. At work, the environment shifted, colleagues offering genuine support after I shared the story, the societal prejudice giving way to understanding. Family visits from Chicago brought warmth, my parents sitting with Julian, sharing stories, the acceptance I once craved now present. A small trip to the lake shore provided fresh air, Julian's strength returning in fits, the romantic spark flickering during a sunset walk. The growth peaked when I organized a virtual support group for partners, the experience teaching me leadership I never knew I had. Julian opened up about his fears, the cold words a shield. He no longer needed the bond, rebuilding layer by layer. Medical updates brought cautious optimism, the lymphoma responding, the future extending beyond months. Friends celebrated small victories, Marcus toasting to resilience, the community we built sustaining us. Internal reflections filled quiet nights, the awakening transforming me into a man who valued authenticity over comfort. Julian's setbacks tested us, but each one strengthened the resolve, the sacrifices worthwhile. The week closed with a quiet dinner at home, his hand in mine, the happiness from scene 2 of our story returning in new form. In the final stretch of treatment, breakthroughs emerged as Julian finally explained his initial cold reaction stemmed from love and fear of watching me suffer the same way he had lost others, the honesty healing what words once broke. We rebuilt with new rules, open conversations about needs and boundaries, the relationship evolving into something deeper than the early years. My growth showed in every choice, the career path I forged on my terms, the family ties strengthened, the societal battles faced head on. Julian's health stabilized, the lymphoma in remission, the months we gained feeling like a gift. We returned to the beach in California, the same spot from our happy memories, the embrace full of gratitude and promise. The journey complete, Victor stood taller, the awakening permanent. True or false? Pushing your partner away during a serious illness is ultimately an act of kindness rather than selfishness.